All right, we have gotten to the point where we're ready to plunge into specifics of the purity legislation. So I'm not going to read all of any of these chapters. I'll probably read all of chapter 12 because it's very short. But I'll just highlight a few things in each section and try to explain the logic of each of these chapters and each of the forms of impurity. The overall scheme, you'll remember, was this. After the fall of the priests in Leviticus 10, it's like another fall of man. It's like another sin of Adam. In Genesis 3, we move from the fall of man to the Lord's confrontation and the imposing of curses on Adam and Eve. In Leviticus, we move from the fall of the priests into a series of chapters about uncleanness, which I have suggested are related to the curses and are physical manifestations or physical symbols of the curse. And as symbols of the curse, they exclude the unclean from the presence of God. I've said this, but let me underline it again and just make it explicit. Impurity does not have to do with withdrawal from everyday life. In some extreme occasions, it does. Normally, it just means you can't go to the sanctuary. You can't go into the presence of God. Practically, what does that mean? Well, unless you're going to a feast or you're planning to go offer a sacrifice at the tabernacle, it probably is not going to affect your life directly at all, but you're required to get to a position of cleanness, even if you're not going to the tabernacle. So you need to go through the rituals of purification. But it has to do with sanctuary access, not with anything else. So you could have a state of impurity which is not itself sin, could flip over into a state of sin. If, for example, you you've contracted some kind of impurity and you ignore the instructions about how to become pure. You've eaten something unclean and you don't wash your clothes at the end of the day as you're required to. Then you're rebelling against the Lord, and that's a moral failure, and that's a different kind of thing. But just the impurity itself is not sin. It prevents sanctuary access. So those are the links between Genesis 3 and Leviticus that I'm going to develop. And we're going to start out by looking at chapter 11, which is the legislation concerning unclean foods, unclean meats. Let me read the first 8 verses, which lay out the rules concerning land animals. The Lord spoke again to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, these are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever divides a hoof, thus making split hoofs, and chews the cud among the animals, that you may eat. Nevertheless, you are not to eat of these among those which chew the cud, or among those which divide the hoof. The camel, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof, it is unclean to you. Likewise the rock badger, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof, it is unclean to you. The rabbit also, for though it chews cud, it does not divide the hoof, it is unclean to you. And the pig, for though it divides the hoof, thus making a split hoof, it does not chew cud, it is unclean to you. You shall not eat of their flesh, nor touch their carcasses, they are unclean to you." Okay, let me skip down to verse 24 and a few of those verses just to fill out the last comment about touching carcasses. "By these, moreover, you shall be made unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean until evening. Whoever picks up any of the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Concerning all the animals which divide the hoof but do not make a split hoof, or which do not chew the cud, they are unclean to you. Whoever touches them becomes unclean. Also, whatever walks on its paws among all the creatures that walk on all fours are unclean to you. Whoever touches their carcasses becomes unclean until evening, and the one who picks up their carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening, and they are unclean to you." Okay. A few things, a preliminary, a more general nature of chapter 11. Chapter 11 is divided into different categories of creatures, And the creatures are categorized by their environment, by where they live. The first 8 verses are about land animals. The second section, from verses 9 through 12, is about creatures of the water. From verses 13 through 19, we have basically just a list of unclean birds, of flying things. And then there are insects, things that are on the earth, things that are creeping things that are on the earth that are a separate category. These different categories all come from Genesis 1. And as in Genesis 1, they're classified by where they live. Land animals are most of the things that are listed here are mammals, but they're not classified as mammals. They're not classified by reproduction as we have. So things that we would classify differently are classified as land animals because of the environment that they live in. The same thing with fish. By our classification system, there are creatures in the sea that are mammals and don't count as fish. So by our classification system, a whale would be closer to an elephant than it would be to a salmon, because the way that they reproduce. That's one of the basic standards that we use to identify different categories. That's the taxonomy we use. That's not the taxonomy of ancient Israel, and their taxonomy is pretty straightforward and actually simpler, because you just look at where the animal is and you can figure out what kind of animal it is. If it's in the water, it's a water creature. If it's on the land, it's a land creature. If it's flying in the air, it's a flying thing. The bat is included among the birds or the flying things in Leviticus 11. To us, that seems unscientific. It seems like you've got a flying animal that's in the wrong category, because bats are mammals and they are not birds. But the Israelites and the Hebrew Bible classifying by just the obvious visual fact that birds are flying things, that they're in the air. Birds actually are air creatures, so you have categories of air creatures. They fly across the face of the firmament. That's the language of Genesis 1. You have land creatures, and then you have creatures of the water under the earth. That's the basic structure of the created reality. You have heaven above, earth beneath, waters under the earth. That, I should say, is the basic structure of visible reality. And there are different creatures that exist in those different environments: birds, land animals, and fish. The creeping things are in a somewhat different category. They could be classified as land animals, but different languages used. Behemoth, you might remember behemoth from the book of Job. Behemoth is a general term for a land animal, sometimes used specifically for domesticated animals. Behemoth that's used in Job is just a plural of behemoth. So that's the term that's used for land animals that are listed in verses 1 through 8. The land animals that are classified as creeping things, I think the verb for creep or swarm is kamets. I'm not remembering the Hebrew word for the creeping things themselves. And the creeping things are insects, but also include things like snakes, lizards, and I think it's still an environmental classification. They could be classified with the behemoth, with the land animals because of their environment, but they are animals, creatures that cross boundaries. They move across from a boundary from outside human life to inside human life. Got animals that are domesticated animals that are within the realm of humanity. All of the sacrificial animals are within that classification. They're all domesticated animals. And so they have this close relationship with the human beings. Then you have animals that are outside, wild animals, but then you have these sneaky animals that slip through, go back and forth between. Mice are in that category. They can slip into your house. Lizards are in that category. Lizards are very wise, Solomon says, because they are a small thing, but they can slip their way. They can find their way into kings' houses. They can slip through anything. Insects. We got cockroaches in Alabama that can get through. Apparently, walk through closed doors. They're magic. But the smallest kind of space that they can squeeze themselves through. Those kind of creeping things. They're low to the ground. That's one feature of the creeping thing. But they're also things that cross the boundaries, particularly the boundaries between outside human dwelling places and inside human dwelling places. So I started to say birds have a double environment in Genesis 1. Birds fly across the face of the firmament, but birds are also on land. They multiply on land, and then they fly across the face of the firmament. So birds often end up representing kind of mediating figures, mediating human figures. That is, the bird which goes from land to sky and back figures angels. Angels are winged creatures like birds are. Cherubim are winged creatures like birds are, and they're mediators between heaven and earth. The Spirit himself, from the very first appearance of the Spirit, he's represented as some kind of winged creature. He's not a creature, but he's some kind of winged thing because he's hovering over the face of the waters in Genesis 1:2. And then, of course, at the baptism of Jesus, he comes down in the form of a dove. In accounts of the Exodus, describes the Lord carrying Israel on eagle's wings out of Egypt. And that's, I think it's a reference to the glory of the Lord that we've talked about, but that glory of the Lord is being described as a great eagle. And I think that's also an image of the Spirit who's leading Israel out from Egypt and out into the wilderness. So you have, that's the basic taxonomy of living creatures that Genesis 1 gives us. Leviticus 11 is based on that same taxonomy. It's dividing creatures into the same subcategories of earthly creatures and dealing with each of them separately. The fact that you have different animal creatures that are linked with different environments. Well, let me back up and say this first. Animals represent human beings. That's an obvious, that's kind of universal cultural phenomenon, that you have fables about animals that represent human beings. You have heroic figures of the past that are portrayed as certain kinds of animals. I mean, you've got a Lion of Judah, right, here in Ethiopia, who used to rule Ethiopia. It's a lion. Didn't he wear a lion skin? Haile Selassie wore a lion skin, right? Am I right? Yeah. So I just want affirmation. Thank you. I need affirmation. So that's culturally universal, and it's just built into the way the world works. That there are analogies between certain kind of animals and certain kind of humans. Certain kind of animals are lions. Certain kind of animals are sheep. Certain kind of animals are prey. A certain kind of humans are prey. Certain kind of humans are predators. The Proverbs talk about this analogy in various ways. When Solomon's talking about the lizard slipping into the house of the king, he's not just talking about lizards. He's saying something about wisdom and the way that the wise man is able to slip his way into positions of power, into realms of power, and affect the direction of things. Or the famous one in Proverbs is, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, learn of his ways and be wise." Ants represent industrious human beings. You can have the sloth, which represents slothful human beings. That's not in the Bible, but that would work. That's built into the sacrificial system, of course, right? I've been saying all week that the sacrificial system, it designates the animal as a representative of the worshiper who is going to do things and suffer things that the worshiper, on behalf of the worshiper. He's going to suffer death in order to free the worshiper from death. He's going to go into the Lord's fire and be joined to the Lord's fire and be consumed by the Lord's fire on behalf of the worshiper. He draws near to the Lord in a way that the worshiper can't, because the animal represents the person. Okay, so you have that that general relationship between animals and beings. And then you plug that into this taxonomy of heaven above, earth beneath, and waters under the earth. And you have different sorts of animals in different sorts of environments represent different sorts of human beings. Okay. So we can start with the distinction between land animals and sea animals, land animals and water animals. That distinction emerges on day 3 of the creation. That's when God forms dry land, and dry land emerges from the waters, and you have a distinction between land and sea. And you have creatures of the sea appear first on day 5, creatures of the land appear on day 6. But that arrangement of land and sea with different creatures on it comes to represent, in the course of the Old Testament, the distinction between Israel and the Gentiles. Maybe you can run through some memory of Old Testament passages that represent the Gentile nations as a surging, raging sea. Psalm 2 kind of picks up on that imagery. The nations are in an uproar. The peoples imagine a vain thing. They're surging like waves of the sea. They're uncontrolled, constantly in motion, violent. In Isaiah, when Isaiah predicts at the beginning of Isaiah, the invasion of Assyria, he pictures it as the overflow of the Euphrates. The Euphrates is going to overflow, and then the waters of the Euphrates are going to overflow into the land of Israel. It's going to engulf the northern kingdom, and then it's going to come and almost engulf the southern kingdom. The little island of land that's left is Jerusalem, and the Lord defeats the Assyrians and they retreat, and the waters recede. Another variation of this is the fact that you have images of sea creatures as images of Gentile powers. Jeremiah portrays Nebuchadnezzar as a sea monster. Jonah is swallowed by a great fish and then spat out onto dry land. That's an image, a kind of allegory of what's going to happen to Israel. Israel is going to plunge into the Sea of the Gentiles. The great, in Jonah's day, it's the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire, which is the great sea monster of the time, is going to swallow up Israel. But then eventually Assyria is going to spew them back out into dry land. That swallowing by the sea monster and spewing out on land is an image of exile and return, exile in the sea, and then return to the land. So so you have land and sea that represented that kind of representation. In the Old Testament, Israel is represented by land animals. Leaders of Israel get their training by herding and shepherding land animals. Turn the page to the New Testament, and it's very different. Jesus is surrounded by fishermen, and he's on the water a lot in a boat. That's very rare in the Old Testament for Israelites to go on boats. Jesus is eating fish all the time. You have this shift from the Old to the New Testament, from a land-based set of imagery and land animal-based set of imagery to sea-based imagery, especially in the ministry of Jesus, and sea creatures. Jesus does use the land imagery. You are the flock of God. But he also says, you are fishers, or the apostles are fishers of men. That's not just going out and fishing for human beings that are represented by fish, but it's fishing for Gentiles specifically, because Gentiles are represented by fish who live in the sea that represents the Gentiles. Yeah. And then birds, as I said, they are those mediators between land and sea. They're between heaven and earth, between the sky and earth. And I think that one of the ways that works itself out in the Old Testament imagery is as an image of priests. Priests are represented by birds. I think it's part of the imagery that we looked at this in Leviticus 14 yesterday. The ritual for the purification of the leper. We focused on the stuff that overlapped with the ordination rite, with the blood on the ear, the thumb, and the toe. But before they do that, they have a couple of birds. They slay one bird and then they release one bird. And I think the reason why you use birds in that situation is partly because you've got this image of freedom. It's a substitute and a release. It's a kind of Passover event. But also you're using birds because the leper is being restored, as I've been saying, it's being restored to a priestly status within Israel. Okay. That's the big sketch of the world of animals and environments that Leviticus 11 is operating in. And what that means is when you're talking about clean and unclean foods, you're talking about relations between different categories of human beings. Clean animals, clean land animals represent clean people. Unclean land animals represent unclean people, but within the land, right? So that's a picture of clean and unclean within Israel. You've got sacrificial animals, which are a different category. They represent priests or people of God. You have land animals, or clean land animals, which represent clean Gentiles who are part of the land, although they're not Israelites. When you go to creatures of the sea, you're moving out to the Gentile world, and the symbolism of the sea creatures is the Gentile world, and so on. Okay. Now, to get to the specifics, how do you know, thinking specifically about land animals, how do you know that a land animal can be eaten? What do you look for? Two things. There are two things that we probably wouldn't expect. We might think pigs are unclean because they wallow in mud. Pigs are unclean because they'll eat just anything. Okay. But the two things that distinguish clean animals from unclean animals has to do with their contact with the ground and what they do with their food. They're chewing or not chewing the cud. Okay. The creatures that are clean are creatures that have both hooves, split hooves, and also chew the cud. You need both. You can have an animal with a split hoof that does not chew the cud. That's the pig, right? The pig, though it divides the hoof, thus making a split hoof, did not chew the cud. It's unclean to you. So getting one of the criteria right is not enough. You have to have both criteria. It has several examples of creatures who chew the cud but don't have split hoofs. Okay. It's not the general behavior of the animal that makes it clean or unclean. It's not some kind of oddness in the form of the animal. It has specifically to do with their feet and their way of eating. Okay. The feet, I think, are the easier of the two to tease out why that would be the case. We go back to Genesis 3. We talked this morning about the ground being cursed in relation to man. If you get dust on you, then that's the ground. That's a sign of the curse. If you wear that dust, you're in the sign of the curse. If you're on the ground, you're the sign of the curse. You can think about this in terms of death. You've been made from dust. You're going to return to dust. And if you get dust on yourself, then you're carrying death around. This is the reason why the priests had to wash hands and feet before they went into the sanctuary, so they didn't take the curse prosecuting soil into the sanctuary with them. So if you have an animal whose feet are right on the ground, who's making direct contact with the ground, that means it's unclean, because there's nothing that separates it from the ground that is cursed in relation to man. The paradigm case of an animal on the ground in the dust is, of course, the belly walker, the serpent. And I think verse 42 provides a kind of key to understanding this part of the unclean animal legislation. Whatever crawls on its belly, whatever walks on all fours, whatever has many feet, in respect to every swarming thing that swarms on the earth, you shall not eat them, for they are detestable. Okay. The word belly, gachon in the Hebrew, transliterate that for you, used twice in the Pentateuch, here in Leviticus 11, and you remember the other place where it's used is in Genesis 3. Gachon. Genesis 3 is the serpent. His curse is to be in the dust. The dust, again, is cursed in relation to man. He's going to eat dust. And any animal that resembles the serpent has to be avoided. You don't want to consume and make part of yourself a serpent-like animal. Okay? So that's talking specifically about the swarming things on the earth that are actually right in the dust. But an animal like a lion, it's not crawling around in the dust like a serpent is, but doesn't have any shoes on. It doesn't have any hoofs that separate it from the dust either. It's got its paws right on the dust, and other kinds of footwear, as it were, don't separate the animal from the dust, and so they bear the curse and are serpent-like in that respect. Okay, so that's part of the logic. So the split hoof gives the animal a kind of shoe that allows him to walk in the dust without having contact with the dust. That makes him clean in relation to the dust. He's not yet clean unless we're sure about his eating habits, and I'll talk about that in a second. Well, I think that the contact with the dust and the shielding, as it were, a kind of shield or barrier between the dust and the animal, I think has something to do probably with the next set of rules that have to do with fish. These you may eat, whatever is in the water. All that have fins and scales, those in the water, in the sea, and the rivers, you may eat. Scales. Scales, as in English, you have scales on animals, fish, snakes, lizards, other kinds of things. You have scales on animals, but you also have scale in Hebrew, as in English, scale that is describing armor. Goliath famously is wearing scale armor. He's dressed like a serpent, which is why he gets his head crushed. That's what happens to serpents. When you dress up like a serpent and you defy God, then you're going to get your head crushed. So scales are kind of armor, kind of barrier that protects the clean fish from what's swarming around them. If you think about that in terms of fish representing Gentiles, then these are Gentiles who have some kind of separation or barrier or protection against the contaminations of the Gentile scene, the Gentile world. So the shoes of the land animals, the hooves of the land animals, and the scales and armor of the fish seem to be analogous to each other. They're both protective against outside contamination. What about the chewing of the cud? One very common interpretation of that, it goes back probably to Jewish rabbis, it's picked up by early Christian interpreters, is that the chewing of the cud is a physical image of meditation. Animals that look meditative should be imitated. You know, think of a cow in a pasture, chewing his cud, slowly chewing, not gobbling it down, doesn't swallow things whole like a snake does. He chews it slowly, she chews it slowly, swallows it, and then chews it again because it comes back up, and chews it and chews it and chews it. And early Christians saw that as a good portrait, a good picture, animal picture of somebody who's chewing on the law of God. It's meditating on the law day and night. This is not the word for cud is not in Psalm 1. There the word is murmur. You're murmuring over the law day and night. But that's the image that's often been suggested. So the animal with this particular habit becomes a kind of moral exemplar for Israel, and they should eat the animals that are doing things that they should imitate. Maybe there's something in that. The connection I would want to suggest, this is somewhat tenuous, but at least it has the virtue of being something that's within the text itself. The word chew isn't actually in this passage. The verb for chewing the cud is actually to raise up the cud, to bring the cud back up. And that's a good anatomical description, because that's what's happening to the cud. It goes into the stomach and then gets regurgitated and is chewed. So, but the verb is Allah. Might remember this. I've referred to this word already. It's the root of the word olah, which is the first of the sacrifices that's described in Leviticus. It means to go up, right? Allah means to ascend or to go up. The olah is the first offering in Leviticus 1. I've been calling it the ascension offering because the word means to ascend or to go up. So that's the word that's used here. That the cud comes up into the animal's mouth. He regurgitates it. Why is that significant? Within Leviticus 11, the verb is used only one time where it doesn't refer to the chewing of the cud, and that's in verse 45. The Lord has just exhorted Israel to keep these laws, to consecrate themselves and be holy, not make themselves unclean any of the swarming things. For I am Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. Brought you up is a form of the verb Allah. I mentioned earlier that you have a Hebrew verb form that means to cause something to happen. Allah means to go up or to rise, to ascend. This particular form means to cause to ascend or to bring up, to raise up. So in verse 45, we have that verb used to describe what's happening in the Exodus. Egypt is down, because Egypt is part of the Gentile sea, to go back to the imagery that I was using. Egypt is part of the Gentile sea. Egypt is also a sea monster. Rahab, the sea monster, is Egypt. And Israel has been rescued from the sea of Egypt and brought up to the land. That's the Exodus. It's an ascension. It's a raising up from a place underneath the land to the land. Now, here's my suggestion. Take it or leave it. My suggestion is that use of Allah in verse 45 helps us to interpret what's going on with the animals, with the land animals. The land animals have a physical constitution that involves a kind of image of the Exodus that's going on in their daily consumption of food. Things are coming up constantly. So there's a symbolic connection with the Exodus with the clean animals. Again, that's as far as I can go with that. I'm not sure if that's even right, but that's a suggestion that at least, again, has the virtue of highlighting a connection, a verbal connection within the text. I read verses 24 and following, and I want to go back there. The first part of the chapter is talking about eating. Don't eat this, don't eat that. And then it goes on to touching things. It's not just a taste not chapter, it's a touch not chapter. Don't eat these things. These things are unclean because they represent certain kinds of people, and there's certain kinds of people with whom you should not have communion. Let me pause and develop that a little bit more before I go on to talking about touching things. Various ways to have communion with other human beings. The most intimate form of communion, of course, is sexual communion, the one fleshness of a man and a woman. But eating a common meal is also a form of communion. And there's something of a shadow of a one flesh relation, not a sexual relation, but a one flesh relation that occurs when you sit down at a meal. I mean, especially when you sit down at an Ethiopian meal, because everybody's got the same plate out there, and you're all dipping into the same plates. You're all sharing the same food. If you're eating like isolated individualistic Americans who each have their own plate, you still have the roast comes out or the ham comes out and you slice it up. It's coming from the same ham and it's being distributed around and you're all eating from it. So there's a relationship is established by eating common food. So whom you eat with is an important consideration, because whom you eat with is not just a sign of who you're communing with, but is actually who you're communing with. If you commune with the wicked, then you sit down with the wicked, you're not just symbolically communing with the wicked, you actually are communing with the wicked because you're sharing a meal with them, you're having some kind of common life with them. And so the food laws are about, they're symbolic reminders of the curse. They're symbolic reminders that there are people that you do not eat with, do not consume, you don't incorporate into your own body, you don't incorporate into your own life, and you keep separated from that which is unclean. You keep separated from human beings that are analogous to animals that are constantly rolling around in the dust, that are like serpents. So you become contaminated by eating them. Verse 24 starts talking about another kind of impurity, or another way to contract impurity from unclean animals, and that is through touching them. If you touch a carcass of an unclean animal, notice, you become unclean until evening. The context makes that clear. Verse 24 is not talking about any carcasses, as the whole thing up to that point is talking about carcasses of, it's talking about unclean animals. It's not talking about clean animals. It's listing the winged insects and the kinds of things that you should avoid eating. If you touch the carcass, if you touch the carcass of one of the insects or one of the unclean land animals, then you become unclean. The solution to that is just to wait till the evening. There's no ritual of cleansing that has to take place. There is a timer on uncleanness and light forms of uncleanness. All you have to do is wait till the timer runs out. That's a mercy, because it means that uncleanness isn't permanent. It means that time, the passage of time dilutes uncleanness, and the passage of time just moves you from one state to the other. By the time the evening comes, that's the beginning of a new day, if we're thinking in terms of Genesis 1, evening and morning at each day. So you've come to the end of the old day. You've been unclean because you touched an animal carcass of an unclean animal. When the new when the new day begins at evening, then you're clean, and that's all it takes. Okay, that's one kind of contact you can have. That's just touching it and, wait, I shouldn't have touched that. That's an unclean animal. The other aspect of the waiting till evening, I think, is connected with the sacrificial system that's taking place at some distance from most Israelites. You're living in the territory of the tribe of Naphtali, and you touch something unclean. You wait till evening because the timer's going and the timer's running out. But evening is also a moment of sacrifice. We don't get this in Leviticus. We get little hints of it in Exodus, but we get it really elaborately explained to us in Numbers. Numbers 28 and 29, if you want to fill out the picture of when sacrifices are offered, those are the chapters you want to look at. And Numbers 28 and 29 give the schedule of offerings for daily offerings, weekly offerings, Sabbath offerings, monthly offerings, because every new moon there's special offerings, festival offerings, because there are a certain number of offerings that you make at the different major festivals. All that's laid out in Numbers 28 and 29. But Numbers 28 and 29 makes clear what is hinted at in earlier in the Pentateuch, and that is that there's an ascension offering each morning on the altar, an ascension offering each evening. And those ascension offerings are supposed to keep burning. They're needed to keep burning, and the priests are supposed to make sure that there's fuel on the fire through the entirety of the night and through the entirety of the day, so that the Lord's fire on the altar never goes out. So by the time you get to the evening, you've been unclean because you touched an unclean animal. By the time you get to an evening, it's not just the day has run out, the time's run out, but also down there, you're in Naphtali, the tabernacle is in Shiloh, which is somewhere else. I don't remember which tribal area that's in. But it's down in Shiloh. You're not anywhere close to it. But there is a sacrifice being offered as part of the daily round of sacrifices. And that daily round of sacrifices is providing a kind of general atonement or general renewal for Israel every morning and evening. The daily sacrifices, the morning and evening sacrifices, are a kind of clock. The sunrise and the sunset are the created clock. You've got a liturgical clock. The day begins, if you're reckoning from the evening, the day begins with the evening sacrifice, and then midway through the day at the morning sacrifice, you offer again. So you're keeping time with the sacrifices, but those sacrifices are also providing for a general purification of the land and of those who are unclean. I think that's the connection with the evening. But what happens if you have more intimate contact with a carcass? Whoever picks up any of their carcasses shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Okay. You just touch it. You don't have to do anything but wait. If you pick it up, then you have to wash your clothes and be unclean until evening. So there's still a waiting period. You're still waiting for the new day to begin, or you're waiting for the evening sacrifice to have taken place. But in addition to that, you need to wash your clothes because the carcass of the unclean animal is contagiously unclean. It's contagiously unclean to the touch. If you touch it with your skin, then that uncleanness comes on you. If you hold it close to you, then that uncleanness appears to seep out from the carcass of the animal and contaminate your clothing. You need to make sure your clothing's clean. And then the new day or the evening sacrifice resolves that. Okay. Look down to verses 39 and 40. If one of the animals dies, which you have for food, so this is clean, this is a clean animal, but it dies, and the one who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening. That's not an animal that's been slaughtered and butchered for eating. It's like an animal gets sick and dies. That if you touch that carcass, then you become unclean until evening. He who eats some of its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. The one who picks up its carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. Okay. So eating and holding, picking up and holding, carrying, both have the same degree of effect. If you eat it, consume it, you become unclean, but it's a fairly mild form of uncleanness. All you have to do is wash your clothes and then wait until evening and you're clean again. So I think Israel was supposed to avoid eating unclean meats and supposed to avoid touching carcasses. In some cases, you can't avoid touching a carcass. If you're a farmer, then you're going to be touching carcasses when animals die, and that makes you unclean, and you've got to go through this fairly easy purification ritual. And Israelites would generally just avoid eating anything unclean. They don't raise pigs like the Greeks did. The Greeks ate pigs all the time, but Hebrews don't. They don't eat pigs. They don't raise pigs. They don't have any of these animals around, and the diet would mainly be clean animals. But you notice that the consuming an unclean animal does not create a huge crisis for the person. If you're in a situation where all you have to eat are some kind of unclean insects, you get stuck out in the wilderness, and some kind of cricket or something that's unclean is the only thing that's around for you to eat. You eat it, and you're unclean until evening. Okay. The heightened worry about unclean foods comes later in Israel's history. There's not an anxiety about unclean foods expressed here. You avoid unclean foods, and you avoid unclean foods as a symbol of avoidance of the kind of communion I was talking about. But if you happen to be contaminated by unclean foods or unclean animals, it's fairly easy to resolve that. Yeah. I don't think so. The one qualification I would have would be, I mean, if in that case you think there's a need, nothing else is available, you eat it. I think in that case that's fine. I think if you're saying you're plotting out and planning that you're going to eat unclean foods, the foods that the Lord has told you to avoid, that's a different kind of thing. So I think there would be a difference between need-based eating and just defiantly saying, I'm just not going to worry about what I eat. I don't think that would be disobedience. I was going to say the heightened anxiety comes later on. And I think the heightened anxiety comes primarily because of what happens during the Maccabean revolt. The Maccabean revolt is during the intertestamental period when descendants, rulers who were descendants of people installed by Alexander the Great are ruling Syria, which is next door to Israel, and Egypt, which is south of Israel, of course. And the Syrians are ruling in Israel at this particular time. And the Maccabean revolt is a group of guerrilla warrior Jews who overthrow the Syrians and recapture Jerusalem and restore the temple. And that's the setting where especially pork becomes a massive issue for Jews. And it's a massive issue not because pork is particularly highlighted. I mean, the pig in Leviticus 11, the pig is only mentioned here that one time. It's not held up as a particularly egregious kind of uncleanness. But it becomes that because of the Maccabean revolt, because the Syrians are trying to Hellenize the Jews. They're trying to force them to conform to Hebrew, Hellenistic Greek customs. And that includes forcing them, in some cases, to eat pork. So, the Syrian soldier puts a gun to a Jew's head and says, die or eat pork. And some Jews refused. Some Jews, of course, went along and went ahead and ate. Some Jews refused because I can't do this. This is food that I'm not supposed to eat. And once that kind of thing happens, and when the pork becomes this kind of hugely political issue in the Maccabean era, then it's betrayal for later Jews. It's betrayal of the heritage of your forefathers to eat pork. And so that pork becomes really a significant issue around that time. And I think that all of the anxiety about unclean foods becomes much more prominent after the Maccabean revolt. As I said before, the Pharisees are a purity movement, and one of the things they're very concerned about is food, what they eat, who they eat with, how the food has been prepared, whether it's been prepared properly, whether it's been tithed properly. If you have bread, somebody serves a Pharisee a loaf of bread, he's going to wonder, did the grain that came into this bread, did it get tithed on when it was harvested? Because if it didn't, I could be eating some of Yahweh's grain here. And I need to avoid doing that. So they're the Pharisaical movement is a table fellowship movement. I can't think of the Jewish scholar. First name is Jacob. He's dead now, I think, but he wrote like 500 books, or wrote or edited like 500 books in his lifetime. And he characterized the Pharisaical movement as a table fellowship movement, centered on purity. They want to have pure table fellowship. And that's rooted in Leviticus 11, but Leviticus 11 doesn't have the same kind of inflated role for certain kinds of animals, and it doesn't make unclean food that big a deal. You avoid it, but if you happen to taste or touch unclean food, then you don't have to go through any kind of elaborate ritual of cleansing or restoration. Okay. Any questions about chapter 11? Thank you. Yeah. Well, I think there are two dimensions to Jesus' assault on Pharisaism. One of them is what you're talking about, which is that they claim to be the teachers of Israel, but in fact they distort the law. Jesus' charge is never that they're too strict. It's never that they're too serious about the law. You tithe your mint, dill, and cumin, the tiniest seeds you have, and you make sure that 1/10 of those goes to the Lord. This you should have done, Jesus said, but without neglecting the weightier matters, which are mercy, justice, and truth. So his complaint is always that the Pharisees are law breakers, and they're teaching other people to law breakers, not that they're too serious about it. So that's one aspect of it. I think where the cleanliness issue comes up is not, sometimes in his teaching, he does talk about the fanatical washing of the Pharisees. That's in both Matthew and Mark. That it comes up occasionally in his teaching. And I think things like you cleanse the outside of the cup, but the inside is full of dead men's bones. You're like whitewashed tombs. Again, an image of external purity with internal corruption. So those kind of images, I think, are kind of bridging the gap between moral and purity. But where you see the purity issues come to a head is in table fellowship. Jesus is constantly and has to be deliberately flouting the Pharisaical rules about table fellowship. He's never breaking the law. Again, he can't break the law. And he doesn't break the law. But he looks like he's breaking the law because he's eating with people that the Pharisees consider unclean and contaminating. And he's eating, it was basically the people he's eating with and the houses that he's entering. And the Pharisees don't actually have a reason to avoid those places and those people from Torah. They have it because they've constructed this elaborate protective system to keep them from even coming close to contact with uncleanness. So I think that it's in the meal practice of Jesus that the purity issues come really to the fore. Yeah, I think it would make a difference. It add at least some nuance or some layers of significance to almost everything where Paul's talking about the law, because it's not just the moral law. I mean, I don't think the James Dunn and N.T. Wright are correct in identifying the works of the law specifically with purity rules and circumcision and food laws and things. But those are certainly issues that are in play in those discussions, because that's exactly what happens. That's what Peter's failure is about. He's eating with Gentiles, which it's fine. He can do that. Pharisees don't want him to do it. So when Pharisaical leaning Christian Jews come to him, then he withdraws from it. That's what Paul rebukes him for. But that's a purity issue in Galatians 2. Yeah. So yeah, and you'd find that. I mean, you'd find those echoes elsewhere throughout Paul's letters too, I think. Forgetting the other author that I'm thinking of, there's an older book from I think the 80s, maybe the 90s, on Jesus and purity, and distinguishes. I think it's a flawed book, but I think it's helpful in certain ways. There's the Pharisaical program of purity, and contrasted Jesus' proposal and program of mercy. That's the way he sets up the. Okay. The food laws are unique among the different sorts of purity laws that we have in Leviticus, because it's the only form of impurity that is primarily a matter of something coming in from outside and contaminating you from outside. You take unclean food and you consume it, that makes you unclean. If you touch unclean food that's outside of you, you become unclean. All of the other forms of impurity at least begin not with something coming from outside, but with something coming from within you. Sometimes that has the effect of creating contaminating realities outside. So we talked about the woman during her menstruation period sits on a chair. The chair becomes a communicator of impurity, not because of the nature of the chair, but it's because the woman has sat on it. So that's coming, if you touch the chair or sit in the chair, then that comes to you from the outside. But it originated because the woman was having her period, blood was flowing from her flesh, flowing from the inside. So the movement of purity is mostly from inside out rather than from outside in. I think this has to have something to do, although I can't quite sort exactly how this works, has something to do with the way Jesus contrasts the worries of the Pharisees who are concerned about the contaminating things outside. And he says, no, the things that contaminate you are not the things that come from you from outside. The things that contaminate you are things that come from the heart. He's not talking exactly about purity there. He's talking about moral purity, because he says the thing that comes from the heart are adulteries and murders and those kind of things. But the movement is the same, and the purity laws are set up to, if you think about them, the moral import of the purity laws. The purity laws are telling you that there's something wrong with you inside. And when what is inside you comes out of you, at least certain kinds of things that are inside you that come out of you, then that contaminates you and can contaminate other things. Often that's the category that's used to describe the contaminating thing inside you is flesh. In Leviticus 15, it's blood or seminal emissions through what Leviticus calls the flesh, the genitals. So it's an emission from the flesh that contaminates you. In Leviticus 13 and 14, 13 especially, skin disease. What makes skin disease, what you're looking at, what the priest is looking for when he's examining a potential case of skin disease is the depth of the depression in the skin, and whether there has been, whether the flesh is showing through from under the skin. Your skin provides a covering for you to hide the flesh that's in you. It's a blessing to you and to everyone else that you have a covering that covers you that's more attractive than your insides. If you didn't have your skin around you, you'd be really repulsive to look at. I guess you'd get used to it if that's the way everyone was anyway. But you'd be repulsive. And you think about that, translate that into moral terms. If you didn't have the cover of external life to hide what's actually going on in your mind and the actual desires of your heart and the actual murders and adulteries and everything else that are percolating in your heart, if those things come out, then that's what contaminates you. And your external behavior is a container of that. So there's that analogy between the way that the pure laws work, and they have that kind of moral lesson contained in them. The first of the forms of impurity that comes from within is childbirth. And if you'll remember from our chart, this is following Genesis 3. The curse on the serpent is the background to the laws of unclean foods, and also the curse that's related to the ground. Then we go to curse of childbirth, and Leviticus 12 is all about childbirth. Okay. Let me read the whole chapter. It's pretty easy. Pretty short. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male, then she shall be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation she shall be unclean. On the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised, then she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. But if she bears a female, 2 weeks, as in the days of her menstruation, and she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days." All right. just highlight a couple of things about that opening section, and then we'll go to the purification rite that's described in the following at the end of the chapter. Two possibilities. I mean, what if you give birth to something that's neither male nor female? What if it's a she instead of a he or she? I guess that's not the. I guess Leviticus doesn't consider that's a possibility. It's a male child. She's in the state of uncleanness as in her menstruation for 7 days. And then she transfers to a different intensity of uncleanness for another 33 days. There are two stages before she goes through the purification rite. There's a stage when she is intensely unclean, just as she is during her monthly period. And then the rules of chapter 15 are in force with her. If a woman who has just had a baby sits on a chair, then she contaminates the chair because she's in a state of uncleanness like the state of uncleanness in her menstruation. After that, she's not in that same kind of impurity. She's in the blood of her purification, actually is what it says. She's not she's not yet purified, but she's moved from this intense state of impurity to a time of preparation for purification, if you will. The phrase, the blood of her purification, is interesting. You would think 33 days in the blood of her impurity, but it's the blood of her purification. So the 33 days is not, it's still it's a time before she is fully restored, but it's not a time of exclusion, and it's a stage toward her purification rather than a further stage of impurity. Okay. Then, of course, if it's a female, then unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation. That's a long period of menstrual impurity, and then she remains in the blood of her purification for 66 days. 40 days total for a male child, 80 days total for a female child. The distinction seems to turn in part on what verse 3 says. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. And the circumcision of the male child on the 8th day seems to be the kind of ritual ground or the ritual rationale foundation for the limitation of her period of exclusion. Yeah. So the son who sheds his blood in the circumcision on the 8th day doesn't eliminate or atone for his mother, but it does limit his mother's condition of impurity. The female is not being circumcised, and so there's the double period before she can be purified. 40 days is of course significant. Any period of 40 recalls the flood. Period of 40 recalls the time in the wilderness. You have other periods of 40 that occur throughout the Bible, and if you think about the flood is kind of the paradigm of the 40-day period. What's happening during the 40-day period is a wiping out of the old, a complete demolishment of the old, and a cleansing that will produce something new. So the 40-day period is a period not just of judgment and death. It's a period of waiting. It's a period of patience, but it's also a period. It's a period of both elimination, cleansing, and renewal. That's what's happening in the flood. You think what's happening during the 40 years of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. That's a period of waiting. They're circling around in the wilderness for 40 years, and they have to wait until they can go into the land. It's also a period during which one generation dies and another generation grows up and is the generation that enters the land. That's the whole point of the 40-year period. They weren't supposed to be in the wilderness for 40 years. They're in the wilderness for 40 years because of their rebellion, because they refused to go into the land from Kadesh, and that during that time period, old Israel is dying and the new Israel is growing up. So there's the 40-day period for the woman, for the male child, the 80-day period for the female child is a period of removal of some old state or old world and the formation of a new one. So once she's gotten through that period, so again, there's a timer on her impurity. There's a timer at least on this. We can introduce once again the term liminal. She's been impure right after her childbirth with the pure impurity of menstruation. Now she's got a 33 or 66 day period. That's a liminal period. That's an in-between period. She can't yet go to the sanctuary. She's no longer impure as she was initially after she gave birth. So at the end of that period, it's just a matter of time. At the end of that period, this is the purification rite that's performed. When the days of her purification are completed for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the door of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for an ascension offering, a young pigeon or turtle dove for a sin offering. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, whether a male or female. But if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for a burnt offering or ascension offering, the other for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. Okay. As we've seen before, there's an accommodation and provision made for the poor. If you can't afford a lamb, if your hand cannot reach to the lamb, then you're allowed to bring a less expensive animal, a bird. It's a 2-sacrifice purification. There's a purification offering or sin offering, and then there's an ascension offering. To put this in the context of what we discussed yesterday, that's a kind of ritual fragment of what happens during the ordination rite for priests. On the first day of the ordination rite, Aaron and his sons offered a purification offering and an ascension offering, and then a third offering, which is the ram of filling, or the ram of ordination. On the 8th day, they offer a purification offering and an ascension offering for themselves, and then a purification offering and ascension offering for the people, and then the peace offering. So 3 times in the course of the 8-day rite of ordination, you have that sequence, purification, ascension, purification, ascension. And that's the same sequence that you have here in Leviticus 12. At this point, when we get to Leviticus 12 in the book of Leviticus, the only time we've seen that sequence has been in the ordination rite for priests. So we're reading through Leviticus and thinking about how the different rituals are related to each other. Then this sequence, purification, ascension, will take our mind back to chapters 8 and 9 and the purification priests. And I think that's why it's done this way. The woman, during the time of her impurity and then in this liminal period during her blood of purification, she can't where does it say this? Yeah, she can't touch any consecrated thing or enter the sanctuary. That's verse 4. She can't play any kind of priestly role by going to the sanctuary and participating in the rituals of worship or in the feasts of Israel until that time of purification is over. But after that sequence, purification, ascension, is done for her by the priest, then she can go and resume that. She's being, as much as the leper who is restored to his position by a ritual that very closely resembles the ritual of ordination. As much as that's the case, it's also true for the woman who's born a child, that she's being restored to her place by a small fragment of the ordination rite. Pardon me. Does that make sense? This is just developing the argument I was making yesterday that the purity rituals are all designed to reincorporate Israelites into the priest, which is the way that they have access. Yes, sir. Just a little bit of historical background before I come back to that. If you have a Book of Common Prayer, which is the liturgy book of the Church of England, you will find a ritual in the Book of Common Prayer for the rechurching of women after childbirth. So there was a custom at some point in the Anglican Church, in the Anglican tradition, for women who have just had babies not to come to church for a certain period of time. And then there would be this ritual of some sort that would bring them back into the church. So what you're talking about is something that has had some presence in the history of the church in the past. The other thing that's related to this is I think one of the, not the only, but one of the motivations of an all-male, a celibate clergy, is the worry that women contaminate men by menstruation. So if a celibate clergyman in the Catholic Church, then they can't be contaminated. They won't be bringing the contamination of their wives when they're confecting the body and blood of Christ out of bread and wine, as they do in the Mass. They won't be contaminating it because they've been around a woman who has a period. So those kind of fears about menstruation and weirdly about childbirth have been present in the church for a long time. I don't think they're legitimate at all. I don't think this ritual applies. I don't think women should avoid going to church. There might be practical reasons why a woman doesn't go to church for a few weeks after she bears a child, because the child needs to be protected from being infected by some flu bug that's going around. She may be worn out, and that would overburden her to go to church. So there may be practical reasons, but I don't think there's no reason of purity that would exclude women after childbirth. There's no reason in purity that would exclude women who are in the middle of their period from showing up at church. And I think that's entirely, this system is entirely removed by Christ, and it's related to what I said before. It's what comes out of us that contaminates us. What's come out of us when we're in Adam is the exposure and the overflow of our flesh. We no longer live according to the flesh. We're united to the last Adam. We've been remade. The deepest inner self, if you will, is resurrection life and the Spirit. And we live the life of the flesh by and in the Spirit. So I don't think we're in this. We've been made different kinds of human beings. So we're not under these regulations anymore. So I think that's a mistake. How you go about correcting it, I think, is another kind of question. I suspect that that's related to other sorts of things that represent misunderstandings of the new covenant and the newness of the new covenant. So I think there'd probably be I'm guessing there would be a range of other issues that be related to it that you'd have to address. But I think this sounds simplistic, but I think it's right. The basic thing that has to happen is to grasp the full weight of the gospel. And the full weight of the gospel is not just you believe in Jesus and you can be saved and you'll spend eternity in heaven. But the gospel is good news about a new world that has come into being. And the old world that passes away is the world where all this stuff had to be done. That's not the world we live in anymore. At least Christians don't. So I think it's getting the scope of the gospel right, and I think that's the fundamental issue. One last thing I want to mention before we move on from chapter 12. We'll take a break actually before we move on. The very end of we have it twice. Verse 7, he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her. At the very end, the priest shall make atonement for her, and she shall be clean. Atonement is an interesting term to bring into this connection, because in our minds, atonement is about removal of sin, reconciliation with God, Jesus atones for our sins on the cross by bearing our sins. And we have atonement classified in the realm of moral failure. This is not. The woman has done nothing wrong. She's done something right because she's been being fruitful and multiply. And yet she needs atonement. But here atonement has to do with the rectification, the overcoming of the estrangement and the alienation, the exclusion that the woman is in after she bears a child. She's excluded from the sanctuary. She's excluded from participation in worship. She needs to be made at one again with Yahweh by being made at one with the priest. And so atonement is describing that reunion of the woman with the community that's at the tabernacle. And notice too, a point that I made yesterday, but it's before us in the text here. The atonement, the at-one-ment is made by the double offering of a purification and an ascension. So atonement is not simply removal. The purification offering is a removal of sin and uncleanness, but it's an elevation and a glorification and a restoration to priestly status.